Hello, fellow human beings, it is me. Before I get into the meat and potatoes of today's video, I just want to thank everyone who has subscribed over the last couple of weeks. We've literally doubled our subscription count, so that's really amazing to see. In seeing all these new subscriptions and this really lovely feedback that you guys have left, I've been sort of paying attention to what people are resonating with the most and what people really want to hear. And most of that is coming from the INFP videos I've made. This makes a lot of sense to me because I think the INFP in particular tends to be a very misrepresented personality type. And I think a lot of INFPs feel like they want something a little bit more specific and tailored to what they're actually experiencing rather than some broad generalization that just makes them out to be a teddy bear, like a lot of the common MBTI community does. So in saying that, I wanted to bring you a video today where I'm going to go into a bit more specific detail about some of the struggles I see for INFPs. We're not just going to be talking about, again, INFPs are just overly emotional and everything's really difficult. No, I want to give you a more in-depth feeling for what those struggles are actually like. And if you're an INFP watching this, I'm sure you're going to be actually able to tune into that. And you're going to be able to feel into what I'm talking about. So without further ado, let's get into some of the really specific INFP struggles that I see. I see INFPs going through all the time. Okay, so the first thing I've got on this list is the inability to communicate very complex and very dynamic emotions for the INFP. The emotions that the INFP is experiencing, they don't really very easily fit into the categories of the regular 7, 8, 9 emotions that we speak about in our day-to-day lives with one another. They're not black and white like that. They tend to be more in a shade of gray. Emotions aren't experienced as these just stagnant feelings for an INFP. They're experienced as sort of like a moving spectrum of feeling. There's not just this is a good thing or this is a bad thing. There's various shades of negativity and there's various shades of positivity, and they can sort of overlap and interweave into one another. And over time, I'm sure you can imagine what this looks like. It creates this very complex, vivid emotional system. And in itself, that can be very beautiful. This is how INFPs often create such beautiful atmospheres in their art, in their music, in their paintings. But at the same time, communicating this when you often feel like you're obliged to just say what's wrong or what you're liking about an experience can be very challenging. It can be very challenging because you want to be able to connect to your introverted feeling and be authentic you want to speak authentically. You want to speak into it truly. But oftentimes when INFPs have tried to express themselves really authentically like that, they probably often felt like it's been misunderstood, or the person hasn't really been able to follow where they're going with it long enough. And there can be this sense of not really knowing how to communicate after a while. And as your emotional system is getting more complex and you're taking in more data from the world and you're actually funneling it through that feeling body, your vocabulary, it can be difficult to match your thoughts to those feelings. It can be difficult to transmute those feelings into words. And I'm sure you can imagine this creates kind of like a sense of loneliness. Even if you're around a lot of people, it creates a sense of loneliness in not really feeling like you can accurately express the nuances of your own emotions to other people. So this can be very isolating, and it's the first struggle I have on the list for the INFP. The second one is INFPs can often get caught in what I would call this hinterland. This space that's not quite the new place that you're getting to, not quite the new shores, but it's not quite where you came from either. It's kind of it's a hinterland. It's sort of like this interim period. And what I think this is it's the space between recognizing the potential of something through the quite fantastical lens of the INFP mind, and then realizing that potential out in the world. So INFP is going to feel very deeply into themselves, and they're going to kind of have these intuitions essentially as to what might be something beautiful in the world, what might be beautiful to create, what might be a really aligned life for me to live. And it forms in potential. It's like there's a fantasy of it in a way. But then when that fantasy is actually being realized, when those steps are actually being taken, I've mentioned in the oddly specific video as well, some of the color from the fantasy can be sucked out. And then you're in this hinterland, like I said, because you're not really connected to the initial spirit of why you undertook this task. But you're also not quite, you're not really, you haven't really managed to realize what that thing is to begin with. And there can be this long period of not really feeling like you know exactly what you want to do. And, people talk about the quarter life crisis quite often for the INFP. And I think this is because when INFPs go into their 20s, there is there is a lot of deep introspective, like, what do I really want out of life? What do I really want to create in life? And I think that being stuck in this hinterland of not really knowing exactly what that thing is yet, and then maybe if you have a glimmer of it, not really knowing how to actualize it in the world, this can be really isolating, and it can be a big struggle for INFPs. So the above point of being in that hinterland can also be compounded upon by the FI-SI loop. I spoke in the full INFP breakdown about the FI-SI loop and how INFPs can get caught in this sense of feeling an emotion and then drawing into it with introverted sensation. And then as they draw into it, they feel it more. And then it can kind of cause this cycle and they can get caught in a bit of a rut a lot of the time. So when this happens, one of the most negative elements of that is that you're not really exploring life and connecting to life anymore. Your introverted sensation is just sort of digesting what you already know. And the INFP is a type that really thrives off of new experience. They have that extroverted intuition parent function there. They really need to be able to explore life, whether it's explore a different country or new relationships, or they need to just stop reading the same George R.R. Martin novels and go read something completely different. There's a sense of needing to actually explore more in life, so introverted sensation can have more to digest and more to make sense of. INFPs need a broad range of experience so they can sort of transmute that experience into wisdom and give it back into the world and actually feel confident through having that wisdom. Where if it's just being caught in that hinterland and not really feeling good, and because you're not feeling good, you're not really taking action. And because you're not taking action, you're kind of just getting lazier and caught in anything that's going to make you feel good, and then maybe you end up getting caught in drugs or just playing video games all the time or just not really engaging with the world. And this tends to compound on itself, right? It has a compound effect. The more this happens, the more you're just getting caught in that cycle. And the only real way to break it is to just make yourself go explore new things. Maybe right now you can't leave the country. Maybe right now you can't just completely change up your life to get out of that rut. But at the very least, take a walk down a different street in your neighborhood. Just consciously go and experience something new and get yourself out of that rut. Because if you're caught up in doing the same thing for too long, this can be a real sore spot for an INFP. So that's another one there. I'm noticing my points are kind of building this. I'm sort of extrapolating them on top of one another there. And this one's just the same. I think a big struggle for INFPs a lot of the time can be imposing themselves upon the world, like upon or out into the world. It's like, I have so much going on inside of me. I know I have a very rich, colorful, emotional body and character, but actually plugging that out in an extroverted way into the world can be really challenging. And it's not to say that all INFPs are going to struggle with this. Some INFPs are more adept at extroverted thinking. They are more practical. They are more out in the world. They are sort of consciously following the call of their extroverted intuition. But a lot of INFPs, I think there can be, like I said, this sense of drawing in, particularly when they're looping with FI-SI. So actually imposing yourself on the world, I think, can be really difficult a lot of the time. Because again, like this whole thing, it really all has a theme, right? And the theme here is that you're so much drawn into your own reality that actually realizing that fantasy and permeating your sense of self out into the world it's so amazing when it's actually happening, but before then there can be such a strong sense of being stuck. And I think INFPs do struggle a lot with this. I think they struggle a lot with imposing themselves on the world and situations. There can be sort of they're more of a state of consciousness type as opposed to a state of affairs type. They're not really the one who's going to be heading the charge, although they can temporarily, they can tune into their subconscious, their ESTJ subconscious, and they can sort of, they can just pave everything down and get everything done. But more naturally, they're going more into they're more of an advisor. That's kind of how I see the INFP personality. They're sort of a right hand to the king, an advisor, someone who transmutes experience into wisdom and creates from that wisdom and advises through that wisdom. They're not really someone who's just going to be out there moving from one thing to the next, ticking off boxes on that list. But I think they also need to learn how to do this to some degree. I think you as an INFP need to learn how to get outside of your comfort zone more. And you need to learn how to impose yourself on the world and situations. And this might mean that you set a challenge where you go meet a bunch of new people. You go out of your house into the city and just talk to 2 people. Just say, hi, do you have the time? Or it might mean that you go do some class that you've never done before. Go do a martial arts class. It might mean that you book a trip at the end of the year to go to Japan or to go to Korea. Go to somewhere where you haven't been before. And this starts to broaden your horizons, and it naturally starts to get you imposing yourself on the world more, right? You really want to try to avoid that sense of getting caught in your own thing a lot of the time. I think this is the biggest drawback for INFPs in general. So that's another point. And I got one bonus point for you here today. The bonus point is all of this sort of fast food personality type content that's floating around the interwebs now. You can just look up INFP on Google, and there's sort of these generalizations put on INFPs a lot of the time that I don't actually think really reflects the reality of the INFP psyche at all a lot of the time. I noticed that INFPs tend to get painted as teddy bears a lot of the time. Very soft, very gentle. They're just kind of into themselves. They're very overly emotional, not really able to get anything done. And I think that it's such a broad generalization of something that doesn't really look like that in reality most of the time. Like I said, the INFP is a powerful source of wisdom when a lot of this information they're experiencing is transmuted. They are some of the greatest creators the world has ever seen. But fast food personality typing, fast food MBTI, it sort of paints them in a way that I think can be very limiting. And I think as the INFP does tend to mimic a lot, they do tend to sort of notice something and then they'll try it on for size through their own experience. It's quite easy to look up, okay, what is an INFP like online? And if you're maybe a younger, less developed INFP, you're going to see, INFPs are they struggle with everything. They're very emotional. And it's almost just it's reaffirming that FI-SI feedback loop. It's it's natural. That's how I am. And this is a real problem because it's a complete misuse of MBTI and what personality type is really meant to be used for in general. Personality type is not meant to be used to affirm weaknesses that you may or may not have. It's meant to help you understand how your mind works better so you can actually do what you want to do in life. If personality type and learning this stuff is serving to encage you more than it's serving to set you free, you're better off putting your time somewhere else, right? It's not a very useful point of view or ideology for you if you're using it to justify your misgivings. You really want to be using it to figure out what your biggest obstacles are and then how to overcome them and how to really become the greatest version of yourself. That is kind of what personality type should be all about. And a lot of the time, I think there is a temptation to want to use this information to justify misgivings and weaknesses in the personality. We need to be very aware of our struggles and weaknesses. That's why I'm making this video, to sort of try to be a bit more specific about what some of those things can look like. But we definitely don't want to admit defeat to them and use them as a justification not to push forward in life. And that goes for every personality type, not just the INFP. But I think because the INFP does have a tendency to want to draw in towards comfortable, that is natural for them to do at some degree. A lot of this information can actually just sort of pollute their mind and serve as a limitation. So be careful about the kind of information that you're consuming in general as an INFP, because information is very impactful for you. That's why when you read enough books, when you experience enough of the world, you're really growing into something very beautiful, and you can do that. That is open to you. So that's the last one here. Thank you so much for watching this one. I hope that you got value out of hearing what some of these struggles and difficulties are like in a bit more detail. If you did get value out of it, I really appreciate you subscribing, liking the video, and sharing this to anyone you feel like will get value out of it. I really appreciate that. I hope you're having a beautiful day, and that's me.